Well, this is the next to final talk on our theme that relates to the search for a new paradigm. And I think we have had a consensus from earlier exchanges and certainly exchanges in this forum that we consider values to be an important element of new paradigm thinking and methods and procedures. So this is an effort to synthesize some of the thinking in the field. And let me just start out with the threshold point about values and science. You probably all know this, but it's worth stressing the point. Basically, there is always an uncomfortable sense of the connection between science and values. And in point of fact, WAS was established because of the troublesome interconnection between science and values. It was Einstein that recommended to Roosevelt that the U.S. develop the atom bomb. And the atom bomb was a weapon of immense destruction unheard of in human history. And it was Einstein who also considered the question of the scientific responsibility for the production of a weapon of mass destruction of this magnitude. And in this sense, Einstein was concerned about the role of scientific responsibility for knowledge not only beneficial to mankind, but for knowledge that could be a zero-sum game for mankind. And it was this idea generated among Einstein and Oppenheimer and other intellectuals that led to the establishment of the World Academy of Art and Science. And one of the principles upon which it was founded was the notion of that knowledge has social consequences and policy implications. And those are things that scientists should consider as part of, shall we say, their professional identity. So, So it's in the sense that we can start out with the conventional wisdom of science that as science of society, and in law as well, the science of law has to be value-free. And if the discourse of science or law were to be contaminated, so to speak, with values, then it would also be contaminated with human subjectivity and not scientific objectivity. You see, it would compromise the notion of scientific objectivity. So on the other hand, we also know that human society has important stakes about the organization of the community, its endurance and its promise. And all of this seems to be tied up with values in some form or another. So the idea of the traditional limit on the use of values in the law, in the discourse of law or the discourse of society, essentially remains a problem for the role of subjectivity in the discourse itself and its salience or lack of salience in the discourse. So let me just start out with a distinction which I think may be helpful, and that is usually when the discourse about values emerges, it's really emerging in two different senses. If it comes out in the context troublesome to science or social science, then it comes up basically because if you use values here, it's going to be used in a descriptive sense. And so what we're going to say is the scientific observer would merely be observing the value conditioned behavior of the social and or legal participators. And if that's true, the question is, what does the observer see? And the observer would basically observe individual human beings acting in the community, energized to pursue the things they desire or value. In this sense, viewed from an anthropological point of view, what we call things that are desired or valued, in this sense, may reflect human needs that the individual seeks to secure in the social context of his or her life. And this simply would be a descriptive inquiry into what the individual wants, how the individual goes about getting what he or she wants, and what he does with the desired things that he or she has gotten. But this will give us a description of the system of community or public order as it is. So in the sense that we use values, we are trying to be descriptive. I don't want to digress, but there's a rather confused discussion about this, even among some of the most distinguished economists of our time. Amartya Sen is right on top of this, because they always want to talk about the empirical foundation of economics as relating to human wants. That means you've got to know what people want. But when you get to the point of trying to figure out what people want, the perspective shifts, and the economist then imposes his own idea of what he thinks people want about what people really want, you see. So there is he shifts the perspective from the participator to the observer and imposes the observer's sense of want onto the participator. And I've seen this in so much of the literature that I'm almost amused by it, but okay, it's something worth keeping in mind. Now, the other sense in which the term values is used, in this sense, the term is vested with normative importance. In other words, the question is not how values are produced, distributed, or conserved, but how they ought to be produced, distributed, or conserved. That's a different question. And so this is not a descriptive exercise, it's an exercise in normative judgment. So these are two distinct vantage points. In the case of values used as a description of community order, as it is, we are dealing with propositions that can be proved or disproved by observation, creating an hypothesis of what's observed, and then proving or disproving the hypothesis. This is an empirical inquiry, of course. When values are used in a normative sense, we are really evaluating the goodness or badness of their production, distribution, and conservation. The determination of normative priority or preference given to a value or statement reflecting the ought will have to be established by some criterion other than the criterion of subsequent validation. That criterion, at least in the context of moral philosophy, is based on the idea that a statement about normative preference or the ought can be validated by reasons external to the statement maker. That's the central point that moral philosophy makes. In short, the moral philosophy requires for the validation of an ought statement that it be justified by reasons external to the statement maker. And if you can establish those reasons, you've established in effect the currency or value, if you like, of a moral proposition. In effect, it's the moral philosopher's approach to the notion that you can find an objective justification for a moral proposition. So that's the technical aspect of it. So we actually will find ourselves using these terms in both senses, but what we have to do is to keep in mind the context within which each is used, and then we can use them coherently. So we don't have to ban the notion of values from the social sciences or law. Now, let me just start out. The anthropological literature, which really is, at least from a social scientific point of view, is the literature that brings into salience the notion of human needs and by implication human values. I think the guy that did the most to do this was the anthropologist by the name of Malinowski. Famous book he wrote was crime and custom in a savage society. And what he distilled was that when you took a hard look at the law of this community, you find that the law had a correspondence to the needs of the society, and the law then came about by custom as a way of securing and protecting and hopefully advancing the capacity to acquire and satisfy those elementary needs in a so-called primitive society. So that's that in a way brought about the notion that needs have law, and law implicates institutions, and it's the institutions then that have something to do with the vindication or the realization of those needs in the society. Well, if the law or the institutions are inept, there's going to be a rather poor realization of those needs. If the system of institutions and law works effectively, we maximize the ability to satisfy those human needs and wants. So it's really from this model American social scientists, including a former president of WAS, had grappled with this, but he hadn't gotten very far. He had a very limited number of human needs in community. And then when he examined the Declaration of Human Rights immediately that it was published, he immediately realized that this was a rather ingenious way of establishing in terms of rights a catalogue of rather essential human needs on a universal and cross-cultural basis. And then the question was, of course, that the Universal Declaration, couched in terms of rights, has complexity. And you need, at least from an academic point of view, you need to basically try to reduce this to concepts and terms that are usable for empirical inquiry and for policy purposes. And it was from this thinking that went into this, and Malinowski, the two together, and another British anthropologist, Patrick Brown, that they connected the notion that the needs really are values, fundamental values, cross-culturally, and that what makes the values useful in society is that they have operational institutions. So you can talk about values in the abstract, but if there are no institutions, then they are opaque and they make no sense to anyone who wants to give it hard thinking. So if you like, a constraint, but an important constraint on the way you organize and identify values is to also determine what the institutions are that are relatively specialized to this cross-culturally, you see. And so, if I may just go to the next page. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Oh, man. Okay. What I've got here is a table, and if I can get this going up a little bit. There we go. So what we got here then is 8 values. I took the liberty of adding another one after I gave a paper in Montenegro 2 years ago on aesthetics of human rights, which Sasha's sister and I are working on, a small book. And so what we came out with essentially is 9 values that are reflected in something we call the International Bill of Rights, but it's mostly in the Universal Declaration itself. So what you can find, no matter what society you're looking at indeed at what level, whether it's a micro-social institution or a macro-social institution or an intermediate institution, you're going to find there's going to be some contestation, some seeking, if you like, about power. Power meaning the human ability to have some choices over the important ways in which your life is run. And if you want institutions, if you looked at a traditional undeveloped society, you'd find the chiefs, the chieftains, and so forth. If you looked at the modern society, it would be the institutions of governance, the political parties, the pressure groups, and so on. So power would be identifiable through well-recognized institutions. And then the question is not whether the power is ideally represented there, because the institutions of governance may represent failure, but they may also represent a form of good governance. That is something that we'd have to look at. But the institutions would have a great deal to do with the value that people want, namely, now this would be a description of society as it is. The normative question implied in this is, well, how is power actually produced and distributed and made resilient? How ought it to be made more accessible, more resilient, and so on? And what we get from the literature of pragmatism, well, maybe a useful guide here would be, ultimately human beings would prefer to maximize rather than minimize the shaping and the sharing of power. Okay? So you have a normative thing that you can use as a yardstick to assess how power actually works in society. Right? Ditto for enlightenment. Now, in an advanced society where you have universities, higher education institutions, they are specialized to enlightenment. In more traditional societies, you'll find something there. For example, if you look at a nation in the Amazon like the Shuar, traditional 5,000-year-old, some would say primitive culture, but they have institutions of enlightenment. They have a tradition which trains the shaman, who is the healer, who is the political advisor, who is the wisdom in the community. And even though it's not as developed as a university, you can find the institution there. You can find the model of who is being trained, how they're being trained, the time they spent with elder shaman to develop the skills of a shaman, you see. And that will also apply for other people in governance in the same communities. For example, I was their legal advisor, and it was not difficult to develop a Bill of Rights for the Shuar. It was not difficult to help them to establish the way in which political decisions were made, how voting was taken, and so on. This was a normal part of it, but we could give them a more modern gloss by showing how you can count the votes and how you can make sure the votes mean what they mean, and so on. Yeah. Okay. Then we come to wealth. Well, in a modern state, it's going to be not only the corporations, but all the other complicated forms that are created juridically and otherwise, specialized to the generation of the production and distribution of wealth. Health and well-being, clinics, hospitals, or whatever, skilled labor unions, professional organizations. Ian himself has made an important point of how we maybe underappreciated the management of labor and the importance of labor as a resource in a new paradigm of political economy. And then here, one of my favorites is the value of affection. Again, you can look at society cross-culturally, and you will find some form of micro-institution, which will be family or family-like, that largely is specialized to the shaping and the sharing of affection. And I've often considered this to be such an important value, because when you consider for a moment the opposite, the shaping and the sharing of hate, and you have a lot of another planet, you realize that this value is one of central importance. You know, although we look at it as affection and as soft, no, it's a really serious thing. If we had more affection, we'd have less Holocaust, you know. But it has complexity. Politically, we look at affection in terms of loyalty, in terms of political solidarity. At the micro level, it's the family, but you may learn about solidarity and that kind of stuff in the micro-social unit. That's where you learn to love. That's where you learn to maybe hate there with a certain intensity, if you like. Respect, of course, is, if you like, something that can be, almost all of these values are critically important at least at some level, because if you don't have access to them, you don't have any respect. So respect is essential. I like to rethink it. It's not so much social class or something, but it's mainly, ultimately, respect is to secure the boundary of the freedom of choice for the individual, or some space for the person to make choices about the self, for the self, you know. And then rectitude, of course, religion, and we know that today, I mean, at least in the United States, the churches are money-making operations, you know. They sell religion, you know. They make religion political, you know, and that kind of stuff. And you see the President of the United States, he makes a point, God bless, and, you know, he puts religion into whatever else he's saying, and so on. So rectitude is there, and I think regardless of my skepticism, it's hard to think about a society, any society, that doesn't have a sense of rectitude and doesn't have an institution in which rectitude values are generated and hopefully respected. I certainly know this, again, from my work in the Amazon and elsewhere. And lastly, perhaps more difficult, was the notion of aesthetics. My intuition, I can't prove this objectively, but it's hard to think of our humanity without a sense of the aesthetic. Even if it's the aesthetic about yourself only, you know? And so, but you see it in culture, museums, monuments, and so on. And I think you can't ban the idea of a creative orientation as something important to the self-system. And Gary has shown in many ways how creativity has its vastly important economic dimension as well. So those are, we can reduce, if you like, the dominant values cross-culturally as reflected in the human rights thing for the purpose of identifying what they are, for the purpose of identifying the institutions cross-culturally that work with whatever degree of efficacy these values, and then the human rights dimension of these values would of course be how we can secure their protection and how we can ensure their enhancement globally. Okay? And so the maximum, what we suggest, or what Theo suggests, that when you take these values collectively, they add up basically to whatever we mean by the principle of human dignity. See? But there's controversy if one value undermines another. Does that not undermine human dignity? But I'll come to that in a moment. And so what I want to do is just give you a quick explanation of these values, and thus, so we can see that there is an anthropomorphic and a normative, but we have to keep them distinct, obviously. We want to describe them, we want to describe the institutions that they work with, and then we want to ask ourselves, well, is the society really doing its best to secure these needs and values? And what change is necessary maybe to improve the institutional capacity to do so, wherever you are, you see. And so, if I may just, now, how do these become important in the dynamics of social process? Well, basically, social process, whether seen globally or in a micro institution like the family, or in a clan, or in a city, a state, or a nation, the central dynamic of social process is that the individuals within that social process are basically energized to acquire values, and to acquire values, they generate value conflicts. And so the most important problem of society is the problem of value conflict. A wants this, the state doesn't want A to have it. B wants this, C doesn't want to give it to B, and so on. And so society reproduces conflict about values. From a human rights point of view, the human rights problem globally is the conflict about value deprivation or extreme value deprivation. That's what fundamental human rights conflict is, globally speaking. And of course, the discourse about values has gravitated technically in political science to the notion of, politics is about the allocation of values, the authoritative allocation of values, so it brings the formal definition of politics very close to the formal definition of law. Now, just again, when you review this map that I've just given you, what you then see is that the human perspective is that which gives meaning and life to the values and the institutions in society. So the human perspective comes with the complexity of its identity, which is shifting sometimes, its ego demands, which are also sometimes variable, and the ideals of expectation. Sometimes you want something, but it conflicts with your ideals. Sometimes you want to reshape your identity, but it conflicts with your ego demands or your ideals. So the individual subjectivity is a complex thing. Trying to figure out what it is in a given context is not easy. And then we then see that these perspectives are driven by deep drives of self-actualization, self-realization, and psychosocial fulfillment. In this sense, the private motives of the personality, even when displaced on public objects and rationalized in the public interest, still represents an underlying force that moves the personality in all social relations. Thus, the underlying force may be a force of self-affirmation, for self-determination, and is the most foundational energizer of the demand for human rights and human dignity. And I think if you're talking about a new paradigm, that's where you start. That's just my view. Okay. And so, the relationship of personality and value achievement may itself generate a sense of inner fulfillment, which in turn becomes the driver of still greater levels of value creation and achievement. Right? So, we're not talking about personality that's inert. It's a potentially, creative and dynamic and hopeful thing, if it's secured in this way. Now, I went through just a list of things that I won't go through again. The authoritative allocation of values. You can look a little bit at law and there's natural law, which has generated some procedures. These are all partial. Sometimes there's a little bit of substance in natural law. Sometimes it's just procedural. But it all gravitated to the ultimate codification of, you could say, well, natural law never came up with a list of rights, but the Declaration of Human Rights did. So it took us several thousand years to get there. So that's an immense human achievement, whichever way you cut it. But central to this notion of human rights and human dignity is that we emerge after the Second World War with a quite revolutionary change. I mean, really revolutionary. For the first time, there's this notion that humanity can create a global constitutional system. That's unheard of before, And that it create a global Bill of Rights. Immensely ambitious things. They still remain contested and unfulfilled, but it's a promise that we shouldn't discard easily. You see? And I think a great deal of our new paradigm is still reflected in those insights of the founders of the modern system. We're not inventing something new, but we want to make sure we understand it better. And so, what I did here, but I won't go through this, you can do, is I really just wanted to make sure that we understood this better. The tradition of constitutional law workings is generally to assume that this constitution is neutral, value neutral. You know? It's there. If there are values, they're hitting so hard you can't figure out what the hell they really mean. Okay? And what the UN Charter does really for the first time is to make explicit the idea that there are explicit values upon which the global constitution is based. Since then, a number of constitutions have emerged, including those in this part of the world that are based on values that come from that experience, and the new South African constitution is virtually a model of this. But there's still a great debate in the US about whether the constitution isn't value-free. You know? Doesn't stand for anything, you know? Well, why don't we just validate plutocracy? It's not too bad. That kind of, but the Charter provides us that there the values are. Don't deny them. If you want to deny them, tell us why you deny them. If you want these values for yourself, why do you want to deny them for everyone else? Okay. So what I did was I went through what I consider to be the 6 most important principles implicating values in the UN Charter. So I didn't want to have our discourse so disconnected from our own experience. We're not inventing something, it's there, we just have to recognize it, you see. But I don't want to go through that, I want to get back to so those are what I consider to be the keynote challenges reflected there, but sometimes forgotten, you know. I mean, Putin has probably never heard of the UN Charter, and he certainly hasn't read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we have a lot of world leaders that don't know anything, you know. I mean, we still figure out they're living in the 19th century, you see. And so, then the issue that we are challenged with is really understanding this International Bill of Rights, understanding its underlying values, and then knowing how to prescribe and apply them in all spheres of human activity. And that's why I also try to suggest to my colleagues in the academy that decision-making has got to have a central role in the new paradigm. Human choice can't be buried in abstractions, you know, like the market. Well, who are the choice makers there, you know? And as Roosevelt said when confronted with the American Depression, you know, it's human choice that got us into this mess, and human choice can get us out of it. Okay? You know, it's not some natural law abstraction, it's us. Okay? And our responsibility to act. And so, now, let me just get you down to something that is more technical, and that is some of our most distinguished moral philosophers, like Sir Isaiah Berlin from Oxford, has essentially denied, Sir Isaiah Berlin from Oxford, has essentially denied the value of the Declaration of Human Rights. I say essentially, he didn't do it explicitly, but essentially. He says basically that all these things here, man, they're incommensurable. You can't integrate them, and therefore there is no such idea as human dignity. You have no philosophical weight to have a meaningful discourse about. That's a large challenge. And I am not a moral philosopher, but I try to challenge him. And so, I say not everyone agrees with it. I certainly disagree with it. And so what he has not understood is that the specialists in decision-making and fundamental policy-making acknowledge that the human dignity idea is essentially based on these 8 or 9, this cluster of 8 or 9 values. And the question is, how do we give it some rational effectiveness, you see? And so, what I've tried to suggest is that you can't ask this question as an abstract thing and say, well, that doesn't... No, what you've got to do is you have to ask yourself, if you have a specific problem, okay, then you've got to understand what the specific context is of the problem and why that context might be differentiated from its ostensible conflict with some other value there. So what we're really talking about is the technique of a much deeper contextualization to better understand the problem and the value application of the problem in a context. And I haven't found a single case that I've looked at in depth where I can't show that on a deeper contextual analysis, the application isn't denying everything else. You see? So you can't make it as some generalization and then go home. That's not where the game ends. Okay? And so what we have then is a challenge about understanding these abstract formulations with better standards and procedures and insights, intellectual procedures that provide us with the guidance. And here's what I think the fundamental problem is. It's taking abstract formulations of value judgment and then applying them down the chain to the concrete circumstances of real-life participants in society. In other words, what you're trying to do is you want to ground value judgment in instances of particular application. See? If you miss that point, you miss everything. Yeah? And that's really what we challenge with. See? Now, I can't tell you that there may not be a case in the future that I can't do this, but I haven't found one yet that denies the whole package of value. That's the point I'm trying to make. So that's one of the challenges that you're doing, okay? So then the question is, does the universal respect for human dignity require some universal compliance at the expense of every other value? And what I'm trying to say is, no. If you have the detailed patience to look at the problem in depth, with fine-tuned analysis and subtlety, with rules of construction and interpretation, then you can essentially find applications that don't destroy the entire package because you apply them in one particular instance. And that's why we need a better social science, and let's focus more specifically. All right. Now, just so that's and in effect, of course, whenever you have a specific application to a particular value, well, all you're doing is you're providing a better approximation to the universal standard. You're not absolutely defining the thing for eternity. The word universal may be an overextended word in a sense. But what we are doing is we're approximating and improving the human prospect. Not necessarily absolutely, but we make progress with vigilance in this regard. All right. So one of the ways we've tried to approach this, at least as lawyers, is to ask ourselves, well, let's take this value discourse and put it into the context of the public order as it is. Well, the most important and easiest way to defend the framework of values is to make a distinction between the minimum order required to defend the public order. Just the minimum. Okay? And there it is a bit easier because then what you are saying is that what we have to ask ourselves is there's at least a minimum that makes social coexistence possible. Right? Well, at the community level, we're talking about just some very basic rules. Imagine a society where agreements are not respected. They're challenging minimum order, okay? Or that innocent parties won't be compensated because they've been injured, or just the basic expectations about the clothes on your back or whatever, your basic property security. Or some basic rules about governance that don't absolutely devolve into caprice and arbitrariness, like there's some basic rules we've inherited. Audi, ultimum partem. If you're deciding between people, hear the other side as well. If you're trying to decide cases, the judge shouldn't be a judge in his own cause. Just some basic things that make social coexistence possible. And of course, at the international level, it's the fundamentals of international peace and security. It's hard to make any progress if you're fighting and destroying everything all the time. So minimum order is related to the most fundamental value articulated in the UN Charter, the importance of universal peace and security. That is the minimum. You can't. What can you do in Syria if there's no minimum order? What can you do in Ukraine if there's no minimum order? You have to have that, and we all have to have a cooperative agreement on that. We can't forget it when it's convenient to forget it. Sorry. Okay. So that is what I think is worthwhile, without getting lost in excessive idealism. Those are the things we can agree on, and we can agree that any new paradigm of thinking implicating political economy, whatever, has to have some sensitivity to the dynamics of the promotion and securing of the minimum order on a global basis. That's where I think we ought to go. Anyway. All right. Now, to move from that to the problem of, and I don't mean minimum order static, because it can be a vehicle for evolution and progressive change, but we need to start somewhere. The second is values and optimum order. We can really disagree about this, you see. But what I think we can say is that human beings exist not only in space, but also in the duration of time and events. Hopefully there's a tomorrow, a next week, next month, next year, maybe even the next century. And in this existential position, human beings are transformative agents. They make things happen. And in so doing, they underline the question embedded in the nature of law and community, that we can change things for the better or for the worse. For the common good or for the special interests, for the sense of expanding human dignity or a negative utopia of human indignity. There's a choice there. And so I think the central challenge for values posed by the optimal order precept is the problem of the procedure and methods for producing, as well as the procedure and methods and ideas about the fair distribution of values in society. At the back of the concern for human values is the belief in the human capacity for essential energized generation of value at every level of the social process, and the human resource as a producer of ideas, insights, and values of exponential salience. So at the back of the human dignity idea is the belief in that the widespread, the wider we spread the belief in human dignity, humanity will flourish if the individual flourishes and is able to reproduce the values of exponential importance for all of us, for the common interest of all. So, what some thinkers in WAS from an earlier time have suggested is that our optimal order, if you like, could rest on a postulate that we, in general, would be better off with the maximal production, distribution, conservation of all these values produced and shared optimally. And that's probably the progressive evolution to a better and more sustainable idea of the universalizing of the dignity of man. So there are a few other points I've added to this, but Gary reminded me that, when you look at the role of the individual personality, we shouldn't underestimate that there was Rosa Parks, who virtually triggered the civil rights movement. There was Gandhi, who basically freed India. And there was Nelson Mandela, who said in open court, when his life was on the line, that he was committed to human dignity and democracy, and that those were the ideals that he was willing to die for. So, that's it.
Great. Yeah. Always lots of philosophy behind it. It's not only subjectivity and objectivity like we do science and
Have I understood that not only you're challenging or questioning the view that the values are inherently incompatible with...
I'm challenging it.
But in the end, you said, actually, they are mutually self-reinforcing.
They can be if we... But choice making has got to do with that.
Well, of course. And I think that's a really very, very important point. I think experience shows that. Pragmatically, I'm going not from the theory, but from the practice.
Yes.
In the study we did about 20 years ago about companies that have been successful over long periods of time, we found that these were all companies that were highly committed to certain values. But we also found that the more they were committed to particular values, the more they ended up also raising the other values, because you couldn't do this without that.
Yeah, that's right. Even being right.
An example, which is not maybe intuitive, but just pragmatic. DuPont started out 200 years ago. The guy came over as an aristocrat escaping the French Revolution. Lost everything in France and came, and the only thing he had when he came to America, not here, I said here, there, I don't know where I am, he went to Maryland, and the only thing he had with him as his property was a formula for making gunpowder, which his family had been doing for years. And he set up a gunpowder mill on the banks of the Brandywine River in Maryland. Well, at that time, gunpowder mills had a nasty habit of blowing up now and then. And so it was a dangerous business. You not only lost your factory, but you lost your people as well. So at the very beginning, maybe for very pragmatic purposes, I don't know, this guy, his name was DuPont, he set up a policy that any time they're commissioning a new gunpowder mill, which is the most important, dangerous time when they turn on the switch, it has to be done by a member of the DuPont family. And he said that they used to have all the industrial workers living in housing near the factory. They moved the DuPont house near the factory. And so you can imagine how hard they tried to make sure that these things don't blow up. Well, DuPont gave up making gunpowder about 100 years ago. But this value of safety that they started with became a core driving value of the company, to the point where, I don't know what it is now, but 20 years ago, their safety record was 60 times greater than the American average. 60 times, not 60%. And even globally, where they have factories in India and other places, it was 40 times, way, way beyond anything imaginable. But the interesting thing was, they started with gunpowder. Their definition of safety now is the responsibility of the guy at the parking lot attendant is he won't let you out of the gate if you haven't buckled your seatbelt. And after they after a while they found that it's safer to be working in a DuPont chemical factory than to be home playing with your kids. So they extended the notion to safety as to what can they do to reduce accidents in the homes. And of course, this became a tremendously motivating factor. They also found out, incidentally, that their liability insurance, all types of insurance went way down. And in order to do this, they had to be constantly training their people, so you've got the skills one there. They had to be constantly empowering their people, because if anybody sees a safety violation, they have to have the right to stop the facility. You've got to empower people, otherwise it's not going to happen. You've got to constantly be educating them, because this is high technology and there are so many things that can go wrong. You don't want a Bhopal, which was the accident, which was what was the other company for that? Union Carbide. That was, you don't want a Union Carbide on your hands, and so forth and so on. And this is the experience I've had in all the companies we went into. Those that were able to take one value, I mentioned earlier in the week, maybe Northwest Mutual Life Insurance, but it doesn't matter. You end up having to raise them all because they're mutually reinforcing. So I think it's a very, I've come at it practically, you've come at it theoretically. I think it's very important because this really, in our discussion of new economic theory, is going to be a fundamental discussion. Are we going to be creating value-free, the Cartesian science that we're only here to observe the animals in the zoo? Or are we here to really realize human aspirations? And how do we do that in the most effective way? And that's led me to the conclusion that we usually tend to think of values as if they're high utopian ideals. But I think an equally valid understanding of values is to perceive them as the quintessence of wisdom that humanity has acquired from thousands of years. I mean, it's not just that freedom's good.
Right.
The fact of the matter is that freedom is by far the most effective value for producing a harmonious society that's going to be productive, that's going to be law-abiding, that's not going to go to civil war and regicide, everywhere, and that is going to produce the most. And I think to found ourselves on an understanding of values that you don't have to draw on religion for that, and nothing wrong with it, but you don't have to. Religion has seen something which others have seen for other reasons.
Right.
And so I think I'm glad you bring the discussion to the forefront, because I think, and Club of Rome came to the same conclusion. They organized a meeting last year or earlier this year. I guess it's this year. Last year at Bristol, which we had. Because they've come to the same conclusion. Values is central to science. In fact, the World Academy was established because the scientists decided that values is central. We can't ignore them. We can't wash our hands and say it's not our responsibility for what's done with the things we invent. So this is a really important component. So, excellent presentation.
Okay. I just trying to open the file because I worked on this for quite some time.
I know you're an expert.
I wanted to show you in psychology there is a big study in 67 countries on value system. And actually, Schweitzer is his name. Schweitzer is a Hebrew scholar, and he did a study and just trying to open it. It's a composition.
Where is the map?
Sorry?
The map.
Exactly. It's a big map. There are this one. I just had it.
So, yeah.
I just wanted to show you maybe we can compare with this, because he tried to go from a visual perspective. He was questioning. It was a survey, and it's been, so to say, verified at different levels of methodology, with methodology regarding basically using statistics and multivariate methods, and then using again the survey and going backward.
Right.
So he came up with 10 basic values or motivational values. And I'm just trying to show you this file because he composed it in a way that some values are, so to say, competent on different sides, and some are congruent, they go together.
Which page is it on?
Just put the link, and I will recognize. It's here. So we open here, and I'm not sure if you can show it from here. Can you open it deep, or how we can switch it there?
Is it on the web?
I'm just trying to switch it.
It's just...
Is it on the web?
It's easy to find on the web.
Yes, there it is.
You can find it there.
Well, let's find it on this computer.
Okay.
Yes.
Because we try to say
It's interesting how national values, let's say, influence the well-being of a country, and how institutions like mechanisms are, like the code of ethics, whichever it works, for individual, for organization, or at national level, gives you the chance to evolve in one way or another. So that's the core of driving the society towards its own well-being or destroying itself.
Winston, can you please comment something a bit on clash of values? I just wanted to know more about the conflict of values, because from one side you see you have a freedom as a value, from another side you have life and physical existence as a value. So think about patriotism. Someone is going to sacrifice that kind of value because of another kind of value. Values, actually. So it's conflict of values. It's very interesting. What's on the top of the someone's agenda, actually a list of values, or who is going to sacrifice something? Are, let's say, Putin, or I don't know, Yatsenyuk, whatever, are going to sacrifice more people for the sake of the more territory or whatever? What's the value and priorities? What are the value priorities? Or how can we
The priority is
I think
it's a very dynamic process from time to time.
Okay, here.
That's issue. Here we are.
So, in his study, he tried to identify, and he came to this, he proposed it in a circle. So, these different sides, like for example, although he put here, power, universalism, he tried to put them on opposing sides, those that are the farthest, and closer, those that come together, like benevolence, conformity, security, actually, for example, comes very close together. But in this model, so just to give you a background, it's a study based on a big survey, on representative sample, within 67 countries. So, to some extent, gives some validity. And these are, so here you can see self-enhancement. So these are coming from the psychological perspective, very individual-oriented. Self-enhancement, conservation, self-transcendence, and openness to change. I find this openness to change really very, very important for the globalization that we face today.
See, these categories are a bit difficult for me because I can't see how you can give me an institutional parallel to hedonism. Okay, what is the institution of hedonism?
Let's see here you see more specific ones. Of course, hedonism, for example, it involves pleasure, enjoying life, self-indulgence to some extent. This is satisfied in the free time and in the free activities that are given even in art to some extent. So, if you want, very individualistic.
You don't have to describe pleasure or some element of self-indulgence as necessarily at the level of hedonism, which I think is fairly pejorative. I mean, you don't have to.
Okay, this we could go. I mean, this maybe is not to say fully strict the names that he used. It's rather in his analysis you get factors, and then you have to name them somehow. These are to some extent how to say compromised concepts that he uses. But actually the importance is what comes together, what makes clusters coming together. It is not easy to come to institution level, I understand.
Right, that's the point. I mean, if the values are going to be relevant, there has to be some institutional correlation. That's what anthropology has given us. Now, you can talk about other things that people indulge in and so on, but their social relevance in terms of some defensible system of public order, that is to say, has to reflect the institutional mechanisms that are working. So if you were to say affection, I mean, you can talk about maybe prostitution, but that's not what you're really talking about. You're talking about family ties and so on. And
here we have in benevolence, he put it benevolence, but you see here mature love, true friendship, loyal, honest. So these affective, more or less.
And these are psychological states, of course.
Yes.
I would agree with Winston. I think there's nothing wrong with doing this, and plotting this way. And I'm not saying that, but
maybe it would be helpful.
I'm just commenting on it. I think that that was Winston's point in the beginning. What do we mean by the word values? It's an ambiguous term. Is it what I value? Well, I value an iPod or truth and freedom and dignity. It's not the same word we're using. It's the same word, but it's not the same meaning. So I would put it this way. Are there universal values, the pursuit of which is conducive to all human beings having an opportunity to realize a better life on the 8 parameters or 9 parameters that Winston read? Are there there are things we need to give up to do that. You might as well put aggression there. But you can call aggression, you can call it a trait, you can call it an impulse, you can call it an urge or anything. But I think we're talking about values. Is there a set of essential principles, the pursuit of which is not inconsistent with each other, is not in conflict with each other, but represents a paradigm that leads towards greater and greater evolutionary success? You gave the example of power. Well, power pursued by itself, what is the result of power when it's... My comment a few minutes ago that if you want to take any principle to its maximum, you have to include the others. And that's true with power, because every time power is pursued to the exclusion of freedom and others, it destroys itself. It's self-destructive. The monarch is not the emperor and the monarch are not the examples of maximum power in human affairs. Maximum power in human affairs is in the freest society. Is where the power is universalized, everybody has the most. And that's what we have today, comparatively to other times. So if we have a problem of language, which a general problem we have to deal with if we're using values, and you've raised that effectively. Let's just hear Parliament.
I mean, I think, one can actually go back to a level below the cultural level, which is the biological level. Because interestingly, when you go out of your way and you help somebody, you get a warm feeling, a sense of fulfillment. It's because your body produces a hormone like an endorphin that makes you feel good. Certain people can get a sense of fulfillment if they push their enemy down the stairs. But we would not get a sense of fulfillment for everyone. push up the stairs. So, there is a kind of that's what I would call is something I really believe, by and large, you might have tribal people which have such a strong opposing culture, but that feeling is not noticed, or the chemical isn't noticed in a situation like this, because you've got totally different markers coming in. But I'm that sure, like this hormone is released and is being felt if you are African and South American and Chinese or European, And I think here is something where I believe, there is something that people in general have in common. They are social beings, by and large. Yeah?
And basically the mental disorder, obviously.
The mental disorder
People like that
is, sure.
In today's world, I'm really mentally disordered.
But that's a disorder. And I think you can be so isolated, that you don't feel even a hormone. Yeah? But
now, there's one thing I didn't...
Let's give Maura a little chance. I promised her an opportunity, so let's just see here.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I fully agree, basically, with what you said, but I just wanted to show one perspective.
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, even in the thesis, I tried to work out different perspectives. I included both, actually, psychological, sociological, and philosophical. So if we go from what you're intertwined, and this is my intent too, to go from philosophical, like moral philosophy, a perspective which is, so to say, a higher bound, very universalizing. But it's a step that we as a psychologist also have to be very careful with, because this, what I just showed, was a trial to see what is it empirically, what comes from individuals. So we have, even if we deal with the concept of human dignity, which I try to do separately from this, I fully agree. I actually tried to comment with Winston a day earlier. It was exactly my idea to base human dignity in values. And then we come to the question, what values, of course. And of course, here I didn't even go fully in the analysis, what is the philosophical concept of values and what is the sociological. I actually tried to see what empirical we can get most out of, and then to try to work on more theoretical levels. So the empirical that I got into most closely, beyond what Professor Schwab's also mentioned, I had here the same map, was Engelhardt's map. And this was what he has shown with us a few days ago. And I also included that one. That was a more sociological understanding of values. And so it's this map here. Right here. So it was. He has shown this one. This was the most representative one that was studied that was done in sociology. It was the World Values Survey. And with this one, as he also said, it was not so easy to come out with something more concrete. Although it gave some understanding, but it was a very provisional one. And one done by Schweitzer was giving us something more empirical we can actually stick to see where do we actually start from at the individual level. More empirical, so to say. What is it that actually human beings, from their own positions, like in democracy, we give them a chance to vote. We give them a chance to express these values more directly. Of course, they didn't say benevolence directly. There were questions to a number of very specific items. What do you use in your life? How do you value your friendship and so on? But actually coming to this net, I think it is a good way to combine universal approach from above, or a priori, what I would say, and the more empirical one where we start from these more individual wants of people. And it is the same thing, my question. How do we come to this more universal level and normative level, actually? Because in philosophy, it was never done these kind of studies, of course. When they started, in moral philosophy, they started from a very universal level. So actually what I'm trying, even in value conflict, so to say, is trying to put these levels more closely together. And I'm fully aware of sociological perspective, of psychological and philosophical moral values, and the high universalistic level. But the problem is actually exactly what I think here we're trying to do. How to make them come in dialogue, these different levels, actually different disciplines. And actually what I tried to do here, it was not to justify this model, it was rather to see how do we put together, because I'm actually very intrigued by Winston's model, and actually the whole concept is more closest to me than whatever I found before in period. And actually it's funny because I really talk so directly about it, but when I looked at it, it was like most closely describing my own picture of the values that I've been living again, the full concept of femininity and the relation to institutions. I also kind of am very much challenged by this. So I'm actually supporting. It was rather just to find a complementary.
I read something out of this because we've been, and that is that we have worked through a way in which you can give a much better empirical specification to the system, so that the value institutional process of power would require you to go through a much clearer level of contextualization of the identification of the participators and the stakeholders, and each would be in a different position. You would have to look at much more specifically about the perspectives of identity of the participators in the power process, and so you'd have to work through the details, basically, of identification of the identity of the power-oriented people. You'd have to look at what they want. You'd have to look at what their expectations are. You'd have to go through what bases of power they have at their disposal. You'd have to go through where they actually are operating geographically, institutionally, crisis and temporarily. You'd have to go through the strategies. So these are all, and they all raise very different levels of shall we say, empirical insight as to what's actually happening in the system and how the power process and the value of power is then organized. Just purely descriptively. That, of course, is not. You may be faced with the question: if the power brokers are racist and parochial, that is their system of identity, then your problem is basically how do you constrain a destructive form of identity that expresses itself politically. If the power brokers demand absolute power to the exclusion of everyone else, then you'd have to ask yourself the question, how can we constrain or moderate or maybe even replace this particular claim on how the power process actually works? So but you could go through or what strategies they have at their disposal. Are they using military power? Are they using economic coercion? Are they using ideology and abusing it? Or are they using persuasive methods of and all? So there's a lot more subtlety in the value institution analysis. But I didn't do that because then I'd have to go through the affection process. Then I'd have to go through the respect and the health and well-being and religion and so on. And that's another big, thing. So the model is actually in its work. It's much more developed and complex than I actually put out here. But mine was a provisional presentation.
Okay, maybe not to jeopardize the time and space here. I think it would be very interesting for me if we could continue the talk and cooperation because I think there is a lot, because what you brought out was exactly what I was trying to find ways to connect. I just wanted to show maybe if there is a chance.
And personally, my expertise in this was that I was the person that developed the social process of affections. And I had to go through all of this, in detail. I was the nut that did this. You know, so, but, I mean, the other writings on the power process and all that stuff. But that's fine. I mean,
no, it's excellent because actually the connection that you tried to make between power and values was actually the whole thesis. These are the two chapters, and I actually tried to make another the bridge of recognition.
Yes.
But recognition can only be possible when we recognize power and to be able to fully recognize the values as the object of recognition.
Right.
So I'm actually with a constant
Right.
trying to connect the two.
right.
That we can continue this
Sure.
one later. And actually, throughout this course, maybe it's a little bit outside. I'm not sure if I should put it here now. It's a different thing. It's not so much about the values. It's more about power.
Well, we have 5 minutes. Can you do something
Yeah,
else?
sure.
Please.
Sure.
Unless there's something else.
Or maybe later for a discussion would be more useful when
Well, let's
See what you can do now.
see what you can do now, because
it's rather
And we come back with it.
yeah.
I just wanted to show not really the model itself so much, but rather the view of power. We were talking more in this case of individual power and in the positive sense. In sociology, there is an understanding of power through the whole through processes, social processes, but more social in the sense of societal, what happens in the society. And the more macro picture of these processes is that actually most of these processes go in some ways of using power and actually producing power at the level of at a higher level than the individual level. So at levels of economy, at levels of politics, at levels of ideology, and so on. So here is one of the models that try to put together, and in this sense, what I try to also stress here is maybe a little bit more critical view of power, not so positive. One of the definitions behind is that in sociology, power is usually conceptualized by Weber's understanding of how do we have someone else do what we want. And this is not a fully positive thing, because it can very often be used by manipulation and obstruction.
Influence and
Influence, exactly, and authority and so on.
Now, one of the things that our former president was an expert on power and personality, power and stuff. And essentially what he was doing was he was getting around the sociological construction of power and class, power and elite, or even power and consociation of individuals. So you wanted to see in all of these there were power-oriented personalities who could mobilize different values to generate influence and be influential. And so that what has emerged from that is, at least I think, one of the most radically contextualized versions of power. So that, to put it in a nutshell, the person interested in power, if he has access to any of these values, he can use those values as power instruments. You can use affection as a power instrument. You can use religion as a power instrument. You can use health and well-being, enlightenment, education, respect. In other words, it's a much more inclusive conception of the way power really works in society. That's and that's a bit of a difference from the conventional political and sociological view, which looks at it much more in the macro sense of but anyway.
But it's rather, I try to go exactly along those lines, because on the basis of that model that it was just shown of Michael Mann, and the four main dimensions, ideological, economic, political, military and political, I try to extend it actually and to propose a little bit more extended model, which actually combines different dimensions coming together. They create even more power. So, example that you just were mentioning, religion, but I was viewing it here not so much from the individual level, how religion can be used by religion, but rather as an example here for this connection between religion and ethnicity of nation and the political sphere is example of the war in the Balkans. During the war, one of the strongest axes, I call it, of power was precisely between nationalist moves enveloped in political frame and using religion to be close to the masses and to justify. And I realized that, when we see them fully separately, we don't really understand the power that they actually have. And it was one of the crucial dimensions of power during the war here.
Well, you're right, is that there has been and remains an unfulfilled challenge to understand so-called ethnic conflict. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I've actually done some writing on this myself.
And another one that maybe goes for other spheres is also how wealth is used and technology in relation with military. So, and then we come to natural resources. So I try to put some domains.
I think you've come close to what our former president was doing as well. So yes, that's
very interesting that we compare. Maybe if there is someone who is more interested to work on that, because I work with house of my own.
Yeah, that's very good.
Because, for example, law. What I try to put here, law is how in international relations, legal framework is used to justify certain actions, like humanitarian intervention. It's used just to justify, but actually it's not the one that we respect. It's not the one that is developed for everyone to respect all human rights. It's rather how
it's used
for certain
sources
it is used.
Power purposes. Yeah.
Exactly. So we have and I came later on to something maybe a little bit farther theoretical, but I don't know if I can speak it out right now, is a Kantian view of morality. And I try to use it in this societal sphere and on a global scale. And I put it categorical imperative, which is one of the basic notions in Kant's moral philosophy. And how this categorical imperative, which is actually that we don't use anything only for an end to something what we want, but rather as an end in itself. So if I try to contact you because I'm interested for, to get something, to have material need, I should be fully aware that you as a person are primarily an end in itself. And it's not that I can use you for something else, but rather that you are primarily a subject that I have to fully respect, and not to have in mind primarily the use of what I want through you. And I try to put it in a very simple way, because I'm not sure how much you are aware of this notion of categorical imperative, but it's a very complex issue. But in international relations, it's precisely what we come to, that we have the use of certain countries, certain societies, certain resources of societies for our own interests, and not for what we are justifying with the legal framework that it is there for their own good. I wouldn't like to go into details to mention a lot of countries and societies that have been going through in this process of power in international relations, and then coming to this moral level that I'm trying to work on lately most. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay.
So Kant wants to get rid of hypocrisy.
Sorry?
Kant wants to get rid of hypocrisy.
No, he's one of the basic, so to say, theoreticians and authors that can provide us, I think, with a lot.
That's still the problem, you can't really say that the motive of the actor, which is pointing a certain direction, has another motivation and is aware that other motivation is the real reason for the initiative.
And you have a psychological level, to say psychological instrumentalization.
Right.
Winston, thanks so much. This is really great. There's some profound.
Gary?
Yes.
Just a silly question. the DuPont example that you have.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for all companies, though. I think Kellogg started also out with pretty much a vision for health, for society, that is still pursuing this vision. What is it actually that makes a vision like this, like I say,
Well, it's a very
within the company, alive?
Well, that's a very good
Because
question.
usually a bar shop, for example, has a very strong vision that just need to be sold to somebody else, and that vision disappears.
I would say that, there's a difference between saying we have a value and really valuing something.
Yeah.
When we say we really value something, you make that most important. At DuPont, every board meeting, the chief safety officer in the company is the chairman of the board. And the first item on the agenda of every board meeting is safety reports. And for DuPont, it's not that, are we better than the national or global average? How did we have an accident? Every accident, needs to be reported and discussed. So I think it's a question of commitment. But it goes beyond that. What Winston presented about institutions, we have traced it down in the company. What is the process by which values are actually implemented? The first thing you see is, it doesn't mean you put it up on the corporate value sheet or you put it in your annual report. There really must be a commitment. The second thing is, unless you're going to translate that vague, general idea into some operational standards, I don't know what you mean by it. If you say safety is important, well, I had less accidents than that guy. We only lost 3 people last week. I'm doing better. Our competitors lost 10. Their standard is 0 accidents. They believe every accident is avoidable. And every time they have an accident, they look at it as a failure. Not, we're doing better than before. Wait, there's a little more. Then they say, if you look, how does it go? So this gives a clear direction. We all know what we want by defining it operationally. Then the question is, who's responsible? In the structure, in the organization, you can see at every level of the company, from the chairman down, every foreman in every DuPont plant has the responsibility to train his staff every day on at least one safety measure. And I gave you the example of the parking lot attendant has a responsibility for safety. It's defined everywhere. So authority and responsibility is clearly defined all the way down. Then, systems. What are the systems you have in the organization, not only to measure it, but to avoid it, to ensure that it doesn't happen? How does it impact on your preventive maintenance programs? Because a lot of accidents come because of poor preventive maintenance. So it turns out DuPont not only has the best safety record in the chemical industry, by far and away they have the lowest breakdown rate. And it was interesting because we went and interviewed them and asked them, well, you talked about safety, and they tell you everything about safety. And when we said, well, now let's talk about your preventive maintenance system, say, we don't talk about that. That's a strategic advantage, competitive advantage we have. But it came out of safety.
Yeah.
It came out of, we have to prevent breakdowns, because breakdowns are where accidents are most common. And then what is the training you need? It's not enough you say people are responsible. It's not enough you set goals. It's not enough you have systems. What is the training you have to give people? And that's why every day they're doing it. And how do you incentivize?
No, I agree on that.
So there's a process for that. The companies that talk it, of course every company talks something. But do they really mean it? If they really mean it, I found it goes all the way down.
No, but the important thing is, how do you really manage to keep this alive? And clearly it's become a part of the culture.
Absolutely.
But it's beyond the authority of the CEO. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That it's part of the culture. That's what it means to become part of the culture. What you take as a high conceptual ideal, you translate into affecting the way you do everything in the company.
So if we can eat those.
Yeah. It's in their blood, we can say. And safety I gave for DuPont because you can see the process very clearly. There are other values like that have been translated,
Because, for example, Swarovski had always a kind of a rule inside the family. Swarovski is the stone makers, that the children from the Swarovski family did go to school in the normal school like everybody else because they said they're going to be your workers. So you gotta go to school with them because then you got to know them. That's a tradition that sort of, in a way, disappeared over the generations, and the next thing that they do is they move the factory away from the place where they originated from, and
Well, look, that's a good point because the continuity, the problem, it's true in society when things change, it's true in companies. You very often see in organizations, take the church, for example. Is the church functioning the way Christ would have wanted a church to function in His name? You look in any organization and it has a tendency, not inevitable, there are exceptions, but the tendency over time is that the organizational structure, systems, rules, and everything that have been created for a particular purpose, you get lost in the mechanism. The structure persists, but the founding inspiration is lost. And when that happens, you get a form strangling the spirit of an organization, and that's very common. It's not inevitable, but it's an inbuilt inertial property of organizations. I told the story of how Marriott built his company out of a personal inspiration, and I know many other stories like that. But what it's like 2 generations later depends on whether the leadership keeps renewing the spirit of it, or whether you get lost in the bureaucracy of it. I mean, is democracy in America what our founding fathers intended 200 years ago? Clearly not. They had an abhorrence for the idea that money power should drive government. Certainly when the Bill of Rights was there and they meant the right to bear arms, they didn't mean the right to bear Uzis and bazookas and things like that.
I just wanted to add on something that could make that quite paradoxical and complicated. I'm going to use the example of rainfall. They tend to, within the company, introduce virtues and values that are conducive to working environments, as you mentioned. But then on the other hand, at the end of it all, at the end of the production line, they go and merge with Extrata, to form the biggest corporation in steel. And what does that do to humankind ultimately? So they're doing good here within their company, but the end product thereafter, Mark Beach, was charged in America, and he wasn't allowed to go in until last Bill Clinton's.
Yeah, I think if you look at, this is a fascinating topic, and it's worth the whole course or conference. And I think if you look at the evolution of values, we would find, in very broad terms, that initially, historically, values were first developed for the immediate group and not extended beyond that. And now what Winston's been talking about is, I really was inspired by what he said, because we're at a watershed in history where for the first time we're really talking about trying to universalize what we used to say is true for our family or our community, or our country. It's an evolutionary step. Another evolutionary step, which would be worth charting, is from the affirmation of a single value or a couple of values to the exclusion of others, to the real recognition that the ultimate value is not any of these things. The ultimate value is something that encompasses all of them, whether you call it perfection or human dignity or well-being or spirit or whatever it is. And I think the evolution has been much more towards that also. We're not only globalizing, but we're also recognizing that the unilateral pursuit of anything is partial, and it eventually turns into its opposite. That if you really want to take it to its ultimate, you have to reconcile it with apparently contradictory values. That would be a fascinating study and a very valid point you raised. Okay. Well, thank you, Winston. Thank you for very interesting points. And